Hello and welcome to the Brothers and Sisters Like These podcast. I'm your host, Brother E. Today, our guest is retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, former commander of U.S. Army Europe and both a first and second Gulf War veteran. And among other things, he's a teacher and an author. General Hertling, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brother E, it is good to be with you. We've had a couple of discussions in the past, and I'm happy to connect again with you and all your listeners.
Thank you. The pleasure is all ours. We really do appreciate. We know you are a busy person, and we deeply appreciate your time and insight, and very look forward to this episode.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. So before we jump in, let me give our listeners just some context as to why we asked you to be a guest on our podcast. So I heard you talk about your latest book, which is titled If I Don't Return, and the listeners will quickly understand why that's so relevant to our nonprofit charter, because it describes your military service during the first Gulf War and coming to grips with your own mortality and what your sons would face without your guidance. So that being the segue, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your past, General?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about how the book came about, as long as you mentioned it. I spent 38 years in the military,
Wow.
back in Desert Storm. I was a Cavalry Squadron S3 in Europe for 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry Regiment out of the 1st Armored Division. And we had just returned from a training event at Grafenwehr and Hohenfels. And we received a message to watch AFN TV that night because there was going to be some announcements made that might affect us. You got to understand the situation. This was in November of 1990. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait in August, early August, I think, and both elements of the 82nd and 101st had been in the Saudi Arabian desert defending against a future attack by Iraq, perhaps into our ally Saudi Arabia after they had invaded Kuwait. So, it just turned into a stalemate for about 5 or 6 months. And when we were told, we expected there was going to be something about forces from Germany going. We didn't expect the size and the scope of it. But we watched on AFN. It was a repeat of a CNN channel with Secretary of Defense Cheney and Chairman Powell. And they said that they were going to send U.S. 7th Corps, which had about 140,000 people, to Iraq. And we would start moving out the next day. Well, I mean, truthfully, Brother E, this was a surprise to everyone. I don't know how many people knew about this announcement coming. I don't think our division commander did, General Ron Griffith. God bless him, he passed a few years ago. But we were completely surprised. So the phone calls started going all over Germany, and my squadron and commander and I were talking. And the next day we went into an intelligence briefing, and I'll never forget that as we heard about it, the intelligence, the S2 basically said, hey, we anticipate some type of defense early on, but then going into the offenses to drive troops out of Kuwait if Saddam doesn't move them himself. And if we go in the offensive operations, 1-1 Cav will be an advanced guard unit in a movement to contact, and there'll be about 20, the anticipation we would be about 20 kilometers out in front of the rest of 1st Armored Division, which was at the time a force of about 18,000 soldiers. And he said, and we anticipate if that happens that the advanced guard will probably have sustain about 50% casualties. So at the time I started thinking, and it was, I mean, everybody knows what happened in Desert Storm now, but when you think about the prelude to it, we're going against Saddam Hussein, who had just come out of an 8-year war with Iran, suffering hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. He had used chemical weapons against his own people. He had the 4th largest army in the world, which was combat hardened at the time, and we truthfully weren't. We had trained, but we hadn't been in any combat. So it's understandable that those kind of predictions would come about from an S2 analysis. We started deploying troops in late November. I was in the advance party, and we got there early December. And I started thinking to myself, hey, there's a coin flip chance of me not coming home. And we had 2 young sons at the time who were 7 and 10. my thought was, how do I write something that they could use if I didn't come home to help them grow into manhood? So I started keeping a journal, and as a lot of people do. But this one wasn't about what I was doing typically on a day-to-day basis. It was more about character and values and friendships and love and trust and emotions, those kind of things. And just telling them what I thought about those different subjects. So if I wasn't around, they'd learn, their dad's teachings. Then we got into the war after being there about 6 weeks or so. And I talked about the war and then the after effects of the war. Well, when I came home in I think it was May, after the war was over, uh, the kids were still young and they didn't want to read, this musings of their father about the philosophies of going away to combat. So I didn't throw it away, I threw it into a footlocker and forgot all about it. About 3 years ago, our youngest son, who's now 42, asked my wife where the journal was, and she gave it to him, and he typed it up. In fact, here's the original journal. This was, these were my writings inside the journal.
Wow.
And what he did, I'll show you, he gave me this manuscript, and
Wow.
he typed it up and inserted pictures in it and things like that, and gave it to me on Christmas morning in 2024. And he said to me, Dad, my brother and I realized what you were doing here. You were trying to prepare us in case you didn't come home. But now you have 5 grandsons, and you've got to give them the rest of the story. Tell them what more you learned about life and what you want to pass on as part of the family legacy. So it was a challenge to me. And it was over the next 6 months or so, I started taking each one of the journal entries and what I wrote in literally a half page or a page and started expanding on it and what I had learned since then. And I sent it off to a couple of really good friends and said, what do you think? One guy was a guy who was with us in the brigade in Desert Storm. Another guy was a New York Times reporter who I'd become really good friends with from an editorial perspective. Another one was a mentor of mine that I sent it to, and they all came back and said, you got to publish this thing. It's really good, and the American people need to see this, because it's not only about the military, but it's also about family and character and leadership and trust. So we published it, and it's been out now for about 2.5 months, and it's been selling really well. And the best part about it, is I've had contact not only with new friends who like it, but a lot of guys and gals that I haven't seen since the 1990s have been writing me and telling me how much they enjoyed it. One of the first notes I got was from a guy I hadn't seen in 35 years who was my driver during Desert Storm in my Humvee when I was in the Humvee. That's a guy named Harold Palmer, and he retired as a first sergeant and living in North Carolina, and he sent me this.
That's so cool.
These great words about how much he got from the book, and he was wounded as I was during Desert Storm, and so we have that bond as well. So that's the story of the book. But the story of my life is really kind of brief. I was a poor kid from Missouri who happened to get an appointment to West Point because I couldn't afford any other college to go to. Had never left the city of St. Louis, went off to the military academy in New York, and it was a whole new world for me. What I thought was going to be a 5-year commitment turned into a lifetime serving in the military and meeting a lot of great people. And I wouldn't have it any other way. It was just a wonderful 4 decades of service with all the people that you and I both call our brothers and sisters now.
Absolutely. So what's so interesting is that although your book was specifically, your notes or your journaling was specifically about the first Gulf War, then it was kind of your son who saw the value in it, and you made it relevant by bringing, the readers, the listeners, the public up to speed. And so this could now replace your grandchildren, would be replacing what you originally had intended for your sons. And it's not, like you say, it's not a journal about necessarily your time day by day as fighting, but kind of what you wanted to leave as a legacy, which is extremely relevant for us. And what we try to make sure our new members understand is that, when we write, it's also about not just your actions, but it's also about your legacy. So there's different things that can come out of this. And were there anything particularly interesting or of note in terms of the healing process or the
Oh
actual
gosh.
physical writing?
Yeah, I'll use an overused word of cathartic. It was interesting because at the time, our two boys were 7 and 10. Well, both of them went into the military too, and they've had multiple combat tours, something that I had hoped we would prevent during Desert Storm for the future. So they both deployed. Well, our oldest son deployed 5 times, our youngest son deployed 3, and his wife, who's also was also a soldier, deployed 3 times. And they know what it's all about. And I think the urgings of our youngest son to write this for his sons and our other grandkids was to show them how much the world changes and how what they had experienced too. So I was trying to, during the first writing, I was trying to give them my experiences, but then I was also trying to share what I knew were our two sons and daughter-in-law's experience in combat in 2 different types of wars. So
Very
that was
interesting.
very cathartic in terms of just reflection. But the other thing it made me think, you talk about what kind of reaction did I have? I realized, I was 70 years old when I started writing it. I'm 72 now. Uh, and I realized that if you don't reflect back on your life and the kind of things you believed and conduct an analysis of not only your successes, but also your foibles and your flaws and your failures, then it's not really a life well led because you have to learn about things. And I think what you do to try and persuade veterans to put their thoughts on paper in either writings or poetry or songs or whatever their genre happens to be is fascinating because it causes you to think. And had our son not given us that manuscript copy, I would have never looked back on those pages.
Very
And
true.
opening even the journal as he gave it back to me along with the type pages, you could still smell and feel
Mhm.
and see the
Yeah.
sights of your time during Desert Storm, but it also brought back sights from OIF 1, OIF 7, a little bit of time in Afghanistan. So those are all important memories to really
Draw
write
upon.
down and
Mhm.
think about.
Right. So writing doesn't just have to be about trauma or traumatic
No.
events, but it can also be connections, hindsight reflections, and reflecting on past circumstances doesn't mean you're admitting guilt or relieving yourself of responsibility. It's important that we put all of our experiences into context and also remember some of the good or better times we had because we want to focus that, especially with what we do for post traumatic growth, to understand how we can draw upon our past
Yeah.
experiences to improve ourselves today. So, did you see that any of that? You kind of mentioned it as a reflection had you not had this opportunity, but that's what you also drew from writing this particular book.
Yeah, it was interesting because one of the first sections, one of the first reflections was about friendship. And when I wrote the original journal entry, it was about the guys around me in the squadron, and I named a bunch of names. Well, in the 35 years that have passed since then, I've met a whole lot more friends and really understood better the meaning of friendship and what a true friendship versus just an acquaintance is all about. And as you go through your life and you start thinking about who were the most important people that affected me, who was there for me, who was someone that could be a kindred spirit, and which ones lit my fire, and hopefully which fires did I light throughout life. I mean, it causes you to think about all of the great things that have happened in terms of relationships in your life. Now, there's also bad ones. I mean, I could have just as easily written a chapter about all the people that I had contentious arguments with or didn't like at all, but I didn't. And
That's
and
right. Mhm.
hopefully, I mean, that's the great part of it. You can let those things fade away, but the true
That's
friends and the
true.
people that affect your lives are the ones you got to continue to remember and take good thoughts away from.
And that's the exact post traumatic growth where we are trying to kind of not reinvent the past, but shape the future.
Right.
And that's so important because it really does make you look at life in a different way.
Well,
So,
it's all about framing, isn't it? It's
mhm,
what you tend to it's what you should put emphasis on, as opposed to all the bad
right,
things that have
festering
happened
in the
to you.
negative.
Let's see what we can turn around and what we can make better in our world, right?
Absolutely. And so, as a leader, we draw upon in the military, and we were both in the Army, so I'll use the Army value system.
Yeah.
As a leader, how did the values of the Army instilled upon all of us, how did that shape you as a commander, going up the ranks with your soldiers, especially knowing that, a lot of us can suffer some moral injury, either from leadership or from actions that can also be totally out of the on the ground commander's ability to shape, so how did those value systems kind of direct your leadership?
Yeah, they drive you to do what's right. I once, I talk about my best friend and my mentor and my former commander, Marty Dempsey, in the book. And
Okay.
I'll never forget, when I,
Former chief of staff.
former chief of staff and chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
Yes, that's right. I'm
And
sorry.
when
Yeah.
we were young captains, we were neighbors in a duplex. That's where we first met,
Uh,
40 years ago. And we both went to Desert Storm together in different units. But, we had become friends, and I called him up. I was told I was going to command a brigade back in the late 90s. And I called him up because he had just left the 3rd ACR as the commander. And I said, "Hey, Marty, give me some tips. What makes for a good commander? What do I need to do?" And he, as he often does, he just laughed. And he goes, "I'm not going to tell you any of those things." He says, "You already know them." He says, "But on a daily basis, your main job is to build your bench and to show people what right looks like." So that phrase, "what right looks like,"
I like
became
that.
sort of for me a mantra. And as you know, I put it a lot in the book too.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really teaching and showing people the right way to do things, and that relates back to your question on values. The Army values, the 7 Army values, is a relatively new dynamic in the Army. They were created, and I know the story of this because I had to put it inside of basic training again. But in the mid 1990s, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Dennis Reimer, really concocted the idea of giving people values to create a better culture in the military during the drawdown from Germany. And those values have returned a couple of times to me, and I'm sorry I'm rambling on, but this is an important subject to me.
Absolutely.
But the 7 Army values, I've taken 4 of them as my personal values, and I won't say which 4 they are. But when General Dempsey was commanding TRADOC, and he asked me to be the commander of the first initial military training organization, he said to me, he said, "Mark, I'm concerned about a couple things." He says, "The first thing is and this was in 2009, he says, "We've been at war for about 9 years now. We've lost our edge. We're training all sorts of things, and we haven't really focused on specifics. We've got to standardize the force from a training perspective." And that's when we polished the warrior task and battle drills.
Oh,
And the second thing he said was, and what we're seeing is a decrease in physical capability of incoming recruits. So with your background, and I've got a master's in exercise physiology, he said, with your background, take a look at what we're doing from physical training, because we're injuring quite a few people in basic training. And it was because people were not in shape coming into the Army.
yeah.
But then the third thing he said, and this is what you'll find interesting, and he said, "We've had a couple of moral injuries to the force." He says, "And we've lost our way in terms of remembering what our values are." So find out what they're teaching in terms of the 7 Army values in basic training and try and reinvigorate that. And what I found in having a little discussion with about a half dozen drill sergeants, I asked the simple question as the new commander. I said, "How do you guys teach values?" And the answers I got were not comforting, because they said, "Okay, well, sir, we We talk about integrity as we're marching to the rifle range with our platoons, or we talk about personal courage at different events, and we kind of, the drill sergeant, finds time to talk about those things.
Squeeze it in.
Yeah. So what I think I said, well, that's kind of a bullshit approach because we've got like 250 drill sergeants at this post, and they're all teaching their own personal
Yeah.
indicators of values. And are we really sure we're getting to them? Because there was no time
No
allocated,
block time. Right.
yeah, in the POI, the program of instruction. So we established a training session on Army values. Because we had gone through things, Brother E, like Abu Ghraib and
Right.
the Black Hawk scandal. I don't know if you remember that one with the 101st Airborne and other
Mhm.
things where soldiers were committing immoral acts that are contrary to our Army values. That's the story why I think values are so important as a ways to rely. And now teaching in healthcare and in a master's program for MBA students, one of the first things I ask students is, what are your values? And it's fascinating how they all kind of look at me, I'll use the Army expression, like a pig looking at a wristwatch, because they haven't determined what their values are. And if you don't know what you believe in what values you maintain, when it comes time to make a hard decision, whether either as a soldier or as a business leader, you're going to fail because you're going to turn into a windsock. And if you don't have something to rely on in terms of your personal values, you're probably not going to make the right decisions.
And that's incredibly interesting because it makes us think a lot of us in the military do have leadership skills that, had it not been for the military, either the training or the positions we were in, even as NCOs or lower ranking officers, I mean, almost anybody, we wouldn't have been able to acquire those skills in the civilian world. And I think we've all taken for granted that that stuff just exists, and it doesn't.
Yeah, it
And
does.
there's nothing for them to do it. So you've seen, because in your civilian life you've also worked with the medical field, so you've seen how that lack of leadership really does affect quality of care
Yeah.
and organization, and that's something that veterans, at all levels like ourselves, can bring into the workforce, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a quick story. I was actually given a leadership presentation to a major medical supply company. I won't name the name, but if I did, you'd recognize it. And I asked, one of the first questions I asked the audience as we were talking about leadership, I said, what are your organization values? And I got the same reaction from the CEOs and the C-suite of this organization. They didn't know.
Yeah.
One guy finally raised his hand. He goes, well, he says, maybe we can't name them, but they're on our website. And I said, okay, that's great. And I also happen to know that because I looked at your website. And in fact, you not only have one set of values, the things you allegedly believe in, you have one set at the beginning, another set at the end, and they're completely different. So if you don't even know what your
Yeah.
values are, how are you making decisions? And that's an indicator of how you always rely back to what's important to you as a human being and how you want to live your life. And if you haven't figured out what your values are, you're just going to be out there floating.
Yeah, that's just a great example, sir, of what we, prior military, especially officers, but I think everybody can bring a different level. So
Yeah.
on that same note, what would you offer in terms of advice to, say, junior officers, or maybe even to a younger version of yourself, leading soldiers right now in this climate or in this environment of drone warfare, of um, asymmetrical warfare? What would you offer a junior officer in terms of advice?
Yeah, I've been asked that before, Brother E.
It's a tough one.
The first thing, as I always say, is you got to learn and grow every day. When I was at the National Training Center as the COG, that was the motto of the ops group. You had to help the unit learn and grow about themselves every day.
Yeah, that's true.
The second thing I would say is because the environment is so much more complex today that young officers and NCOs face than it was when I was young. I mean, truthfully, I mean, I'm not saying this to pump sunshine at the young guys, but when I was a young lieutenant, it was relatively simple, but it was hard. I mean, we had the Cold War, we were doing border patrols, we were, defending the GDP, that kind of stuff. And even though that was hard work in terms of training, it was relatively simple in terms of our focus. Today, our young officers and NCOs are all over the place. I mean, they have all sorts of things in terms of threat environments, training methodologies, evolutionary
Combined
warfare,
combined arms,
combined
more and more.
arms,
Yeah.
drones. How do you maneuver? What are the differences in joint requirements of working with the Air Force and the Navy and all that?
Yeah.
So the second thing I like to tell people is I heard from a graduation speech one time, do something every day that scares the hell out of you. Take risks,
Challenges you.
but make sure those risks are mitigated, that you consider the implication of taking that risk, but have the courage to step forward and do something. And if you fail, figure out why you failed and correct yourselves. So those are two big, and then the other thing I tell young leaders, and this is again, I'll credit this to General Dempsey when he was our division commander in Iraq in 2003. When we were extended for 3 months, when we didn't know it was going to happen, and we were getting ready to leave, and about a third of our force was already back home in Germany, and we were told we were going to stay a little bit longer. He pulled the leaders together, and what he said to them, and it really stuck with me, pulled the division leadership together, and he said, go back out there, talk to your troops, tell them why we're doing what we're doing, tell them why we've been asked to stay, that it's a continuation of the mission. And then just remember that leaders don't have the right to have a bad day. He said, go outside, kick a little stones right now, feel sorry for yourself. But when you go out and face the troops, you got to be energized. It doesn't mean you can't have a bad day. It doesn't mean you just shouldn't show it when you're having a bad day. And really, I kind of think that's the essence of leadership too. You've got to show people what right looks like by being supportive of your actions, even when sometimes you don't believe in the things you're doing.
That's right. And that's probably one of the values also in terms of integrity and honor in terms of doing things when you're outside of your comfort zone and still remembering your part in the operation. But that's an interesting point because us too, as veterans, when we're doing our, nonprofit, we're also saying similar to what you said, that we want to push ourselves outside of our boundaries, but within a therapeutic threshold. So you want to get a little bit comfortable being uncomfortable, but in amount of time and bandwidth that is manageable, but you're not going to grow. And so unless you do. So I think that's just a very human way of looking at challenges in life, whether you're on the battlefield or like us now off of it. So I do see carry through.
One of the things, another question I always ask my MBA students when we start a new class or a new cohort, one of the first questions I ask them is, how many of you are experiencing imposter syndrome? And these are individuals who have been in the business environment for 10 to 15 years. So you would think that they would be relatively comfortable and confident in what they're doing. But it's fascinating to me that everybody raises their hand. So everyone sometimes thinks that they don't have the capability to do the things that they're being asked to do. And that gets back to the comment about learning and growing every day and do something that scares you. If you step out and you show a little courage and you're not always sure what's going to happen, but you at least try, that will help you overcome imposter syndrome. Just taking the courage. Because another story, if I can, real quickly. When I was named as division commander of 1st Army Division in 2007, we were going off in a couple of weeks to go back to Iraq. And I was kind of rotating around, wandering around the headquarters, just talking to folks. And I happened to wander into the legal section, and we talked for a while about what the legal guys were supposed to do. And at the end of it, this is a story I write about in the book. As I left, this one young paralegal, legal specialist, young specialist, said, "Hey, sir, can I talk to you a second?" I said, "Sure, come on outside the door." I want to talk in private. So we got outside the door and she said, "Are you going to bring us all home?"
Wow.
And, when you're asked that as a commander, first of all, you don't have an answer to it because you can't promise those kind of things. But it told me that my responsibility for the 30,000 people we had in northern Iraq in 2007 was they were all depending on me at least to contribute to bringing them home. And that's an awesome responsibility. And truthfully, when she asked me that, it was like, holy smokes, here I
Yeah.
am. I'm wearing the stars and I'm the division commander and I can't answer her question. So that's a little bit of imposter syndrome right there too. You can
Yeah.
just tell them what you can and, do your best to try and make it happen.
You, changing, let me use that as a segue into this next question. So, as you said, technology and also just the evolution of warfare and the fact that we get better and better at it. Uh, like you said, war has become incredibly challenging and difficult compared to years before. And now, with this technology of warfare with drones, I think back, we had one Raven per platoon,
Yeah.
and now they're trying to get it like at the squad level. Um, so how I can only imagine the effects that would have on my psyche or PTSD, um, especially to soldiers who maybe can't leave the base and have no sense of empowerment. How do you think that drone will change warfare, and also the psyche of soldiers? Because I'm worried that we're looking at catching up to what's happening in the world with drones, but I don't know if we fully appreciate what that's going to do to the warfighter.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And it has to do, Brother E, with adaptation. And what we've seen, I think, in every conflict, and I was smiling as you were talking because I was looking for it, and I remember I took it into my bedroom, so it's not on top of my desk here anymore. But I always used to have a Civil War mini ball on my desk. And for your listeners who don't know, that was an invention. It was called a mini ball, but it was named after the guy that invented it, who was a Frenchman called Charles Minet, and American troops turned it into mini ball. And what it wasn't a ball at all. It was what we perceive as a bullet today. So a round musket ball was replaced by something that had a conical end
Yeah.
that would fire farther and more accurately and all that. Imagine what the troops in the Civil
Yeah.
War thought going into
Mm-hmm.
a battle where instead of maybe having a chance of being hit at 100 yards, they would be hit at maybe 400 yards with great accuracy. And when that was turned into cannonballs were turned into projectiles, it changed that effect as well. Farther
That's a good point.
away, greater accuracy. We adapted to that. It took us a long time. But even 60 years later in World War I, we were still charging in a line of troops against the other side. So we hadn't adapted that much to things like conical bullets and machine guns. But we eventually did, and it brought new evolutions. So, there's a lot of people talking about the evolution of drone warfare. And whereas that is a technological advancement, because unfortunately nations are still going to go to war, we're going to find ways to counter it. And
Maybe at the doctrinal level in terms of how
or the
we
leader, the
how we
doctrine
react to it.
level, the leadership level, the weapons system level. I mean, maybe someone's going to come up with some kind of laser gun that will shoot down a
Yeah.
drone in a heart. I mean, all those kind of things will just evolve.
Yeah.
But the key is how fast you do it.
But right now we're on the beginning of that evolution. So, I hope we're taking this time as leadership, and that's why leadership is so important to
Well,
really
one
focus
of
on
the
that.
things to this point, though, I mean, it was an adaptation that caused the drones to be so obvious on the battlefield today. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in U.S. Army Europe, when I was there, we were training with the Ukrainians. This was in 2011, 2012. What I found in the Ukrainians, very different from the Russians, was their culture was very adaptive and very innovative. Now they started the war in 20, well, the first conflict in 2014, but the most recent one in 2022, they started off at a huge disadvantage in terms of manpower and equipment. But they turned that disadvantage into an advantage by seeing the power of this new evolution of drones. So how do we now, and I think the Army's got some techniques that they're working on in these, what General George created, these transformation and contact brigades that will look at how do you overcome evolution in technology with, like you just said a minute ago, leadership and doctrine and training and all those other kind of things. I'm convinced we will do it, but the question will be is how long will it take?
I thank you for that. I do agree with that. I do know some units, special forces have talked about making a whole nother 18 series just dedicated to drones. Marine Corps, I believe, has some kind of person now that's their IT or tech guy. I'm not sure about the Army, which is kind of weird. But
No, the Army is they've got I think four brigades that are called TIC brigades, transformation and contacts,
okay,
and they are actively working to find solutions at the brigade level. So you're talking about individual battalions, infantry, armor, whatever battalions, doing the things to counter this kind of stuff. And what's interesting about this is some of the units that are also involved in these evolutions are the ones that might be in the rear areas, like a support battalion or air defense units that really
yeah,
have to step up their game and
yep,
figure out ways to contribute.
yep. I do know that the Army recently came out with a couple new MOSs for jobs related to drone or missile defense. So
Mhm.
obviously things are moving. But you're right; it will be very important to see how these changes are done and how quickly and how thoroughly. But looks like we're at least headed in that direction.
Yeah,
So
can I say one thing? Because you deal with veterans with post-traumatic stress
mhm,
and post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the things I found as a division commander were some of the people that you'd least expect to have post-traumatic stress are the ones that had it the most. And as you said, we had Raven drones and we had some other types of drones. In fact, even some drone operators that were working for us that were back in Arizona at Fort
right,
Huachuca.
yeah,
And
in containers.
even though they were far from the battlefield,
Oh yeah,
they still had those kind of moral injuries because they could see what they were striking. And it's the same kind of thing. You're asking
that's right.
soldiers, human beings, to kill other human beings. And sometimes that causes a little bit of moral scars, doesn't it?
That's right. Actually, I wrote a piece about that specifically where I was on the battlefield and I was really cut off in terms of communication because we just weren't up to that speed. At the beginning, when I was in Fallujah, we had one satellite phone per company, and our platoon got it. And it was just like minutes every couple weeks or
Yeah.
something. And then it got better, but it never got to the point where it was real time. But I wrote a piece about civilians understanding what it's like to be in Arizona in a container, step out and then go to Walmart, pick up your kids at school.
Yeah.
That has got to be incredibly tough. I almost wish they were like deployed, believe it or not, in some way, because you just need to have those mental boundaries. And that's, I think, what this kind of new warfare will bring is that you
Yeah.
can kind of do it from home. And that can be a difficult thing.
Yeah, it absolutely can. And it affects, I mean, the things that we're learning in the military, it's affecting other elements of society too. I was actually at a session a couple of weeks ago talking about post-traumatic stress in the military. And this guy came up to me and he was working in the local SunPass line that's here in Florida, the railroad line. And he said, we're having a lot of post-traumatic stress with our railroad engineers. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he goes, oh
Yeah.
yeah. He says, if you're a railroad engineer and you're on a train and you hit a car or you see a child on the track that you can't avoid and you kill them, the amount of stress that goes into
Good
something
point.
like that affects a person's entire career. So
That's
it's
a good point.
and police officers doing the same thing, shooting someone.
Yeah,
Those are the kind of things that sometimes we in the military don't consider that it's
absolutely.
transferable to other professions.
And us here in Western North Carolina, what we've done is after Helene, we've also extended our support to first responders, whether it's firefighters,
Right.
EMT, police. And we're also engaged a lot with local other healthcare providers, such as hospitals, because we understand that, you have veterans coming in through the door, or you can have other people, just like you mentioned, that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so we're looking at a way, and we're doing this of journaling and giving them examples, a lot of events when they have public events, but also handing out journals where people can write and kind of have that discussion amongst themselves of like, this is a stuck point, as we
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
and I need to address this because it will affect my quality of life. So I'm thankful you said that, because we totally appreciate that and see the value in that. And I guess I wish we had more an understanding of that, because I think it would help society a lot better if we realize that we do have challenges, and if we can face them productively and not let them eat us up inside, we can really improve our quality of life.
Yeah, one of the things too, I'll share this with you because I was teaching leadership to a bunch of physicians in my retirement job, and one of the physicians was an emergency department physician, and she invited me to make rounds with her for 12 hours. So I went
Mm.
down and actually did an ED 12-hour round, and I was amazed at how much that was like combat,
Hmm.
and how much moral injuries our doctors face in crisis situations where it doesn't
Absolutely.
have to be a mass shooting or a crisis situation. It's just daily stuff. And if you ever watch the series on HBO, The Pit, you see how that repeated, issue of
Exposure, man.
physicians facing all sorts of things is just really something that wears you down. Teaching a class at a hospital about 4 years ago, the chief medical officer asked me to address physician resiliency in my leadership class. And what he told me is the reason he wanted to do that is they had had 3 doctors commit suicide
Hmm.
in the last 6 months because of being overworked. It's everywhere in
Yeah.
society right now.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, sir. And I think what we want to how this relates to our community is that veterans need to understand that they've had some very challenging situations in their lives, but that it's not uncommon in the civilian world for
Right.
other people to have that. So there is some commonality in that, and there are ways that we can address it. And thank goodness it's no longer the stigma that it used to be, say maybe when you were in the first Desert Storm.
Right. Right.
So let's take these opportunities, and that's why I'm so happy that you're able to share with us, because this really empowers other veterans to step up and say, you know what, I think maybe I can write. I think I can be part of a community
Yeah.
and share my experiences. So I
Well, and,
appreciate
and,
that.
and the other thing that you're doing, and I applaud you for this, is I think there's a message in some of the things you're doing. You're also not alone when you're talking about veterans experiencing some of these things and trying to get them to exhibit what they've experienced. There's
That's
a
right.
lot of other people out there just like you. So
Exactly.
come together and share some thoughts, right?
And what I always tell our members is that if we're having a meeting or a class, I say, everyone just stop and look around. And you could not tell, if you were to come into our room, you could not tell what this group was about. You couldn't tell. All
Right.
the ages are different, the genders, the races, any demographic. I have no idea what you guys did to be in this room together, but we know. And what's great is that when we leave, we feel like there are other people that we might not see, look, and sound like us, but that have some kind of probable connection. So
Yeah.
it makes us feel like we're really not alone out there. And it's great to actually have a real relationship with somebody that doesn't talk like you, doesn't look like you, doesn't sound like you, and there's genuine care, just like the military brought that camaraderie. And that's an amazing feeling to get back, to feel out of the shadows and out of the darkness.
Yeah. You're
And
not
so
alone, right?
Not right. And it really, for some of us, especially if it's a moral injury versus just PTSD from some kind of a traumatic event in terms of like gunfire or IED, sometimes you need just that human connection of somebody else who's been through something similar. And it just doesn't make you feel alone. And then when you're not alone, you don't feel isolated. You don't
Yeah.
feel,
Yeah.
you feel like you can talk and you have something in common. Just like, you and me and our listeners, had it not been for the military, had it not been for this book, our paths would have never crossed, and it's a real blessing that in spite of those challenges, we're here today looking at making something positive for our future.
Well, and I think what you're driving, Brother E, is the fact that I don't quite know how to say this, but everybody has a story.
Oh yeah, you
And
actually use
that
that line.
and it's great because that's what leadership is all about. You have to understand other people's
Mm,
stories
yeah,
to influence them to do what they need to do as a leader. So if you don't
interesting.
know what the stories, if you haven't committed to telling your stories and realizing who you are, again, going back to the point about values, what do you believe, and why
Yeah,
do you believe it? That's the creative process that you're driving in people in your writing group. So good on you for that.
I appreciate. I'll tell you, sir, when we're in our groups, if someone reads something, if it's like an alumni class, and so we've had them several times, uh, I point out, hey, did you hear this phrase, which is calling back on another writing? And then people say, yes, I do remember. So you're creating, even in the writing, not just one offs, but you're creating a story
Yeah.
and a comment that nobody would understand in terms of context. We understand because we've had prior. So it's really interesting, that dynamic. And I appreciate you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
So, sir, are there any events or occasions that you have on your forecast that you'd like to share with our listeners? Anything coming up?
Well, yeah, it's kind of haphazard to be honest with you, brother. I had a couple of media events early on in the book tour that were very successful and got the word out. It's kind of died down a little bit. I'm continuing to do podcasts with anybody that asks so I can get the word out. But I've got, your cast won't be out, but today is that we're recording this is June the 8th. And I've got a big event tonight with a woman by the name of Mona Charon, who's starting a book group on the Bulwark Network. But I'll continue to write for the Bulwark, and I do their weekly Command Post podcast that talks about things military. We pick one or two subjects every week to talk about. And there's certainly a lot of subjects to talk about today with the nation at war and some of the things that are going on in our Defense Department. But I have a couple of book things in D.C. with the Army Navy Club and also with a Barnes and Noble the early part of November.
Okay.
So the summer is kind of a little bit loose. We're seeing a bunch of grandkids in a few weeks, so that's really dividing my attention. But yeah, I'll keep anybody that wants me to talk about the book or about the military or national security. I'm open for invitations like you gave me.
Absolutely. And we're so happy that you accepted our offer. We know you're very busy and it means a lot to us. So, is there any other topic that that's at your heart that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, our nation's military is going through some tough times right now. They're being asked to do very hard tasks, which are not unusual, but there seems to be the potential for a lack of trust or a divided approach to the military. And the only thing I'd say to that, if you give me the opportunity to say it, is remember who you are and what you do. Remember your oath to the Constitution. Remember that you are people who serve the nation. And when you serve the nation, you serve everyone in the nation, all 350 million of us. And so keep that in mind as you go about your daily duties and be proud of what you do. There's as our sons were serving in the military, my wife used to say, at the same time, it's your biggest pride to have your family serving, but it's also your biggest fear. And she was absolutely right in that because it changes people. But when you put on the uniform and the people you talk to you're being asked to do something that only 1% of the nation is asked to do when you wear the cloth of the country.
That's right.
But if you have injury, emotional injury, and I think this is where you come in, tell your story. Don't fester. Don't think you're the only one having thoughts. Share it with other people. Share it through writing, like you suggest, and like I did, and it was very cathartic and helped me, I think, become a better person as I wrote this story. But also, the sharing it with others makes you realize how much we all have in common versus how many differences we have. So,
Absolutely.
make it matter on a daily basis.
And that, our stories, because we publish our members' writings as well. We're working on our fourth book, and we'd want to have a veteran, female only veteran book, because we think that time has come.
Yep.
As there, do we leave our legacy, but we inspire others? Maybe not of course, at the level you're able to reach, but with selling our books, we still, and doing all our readings, public readings and advocacy, there's a slow progression where you see that you go from healing yourself towards having enough capacity and space to start healing others. And as you heal yourself by even doing podcasts or speaking in public, you realize that there are other people that will come up to you after the show and say, or after the event, and say, hey, how can I be a part of this? And so your work is also touching others and benefiting others. So it's not only cathartic, like you said, that we mention a lot, but it's also very humbling and inspiring and
Yeah.
helpful to see that we can motivate others to help where we were, say, 10 or 20 years ago, and make them do that in half the time.
Yeah.
So
Well, you said something a minute ago. I'm gonna counter what you said about me
mhm,
having a big audience, and I do. I will admit that humbly. I have a chance to reach a lot of people, but I got to tell you what I've learned, Brother E, is it doesn't matter how big your audience is. All you got to do is reach one person at a
that's
time.
true. You're right, sir.
And
Yes,
if you
sir.
can turn the life around of one person,
That's right.
it's
Absolutely.
it's worth your time on earth, right?
That's right, sir. We've had some members that are very open, that they've called the suicide hotline. They've been referred to us, and we've changed their lives. They're very active members. We have regular meetings, regular readings, and it's totally, because you see what happens. I know you know this, sir, but was when we have trust amongst ourselves, where there's no need to buy in. It's not big government or the VA. It's just other veterans. There's a trust that after just a few interactions gets built. And then when they say that they can really trust us and believe in what we do, other conversations start to happen, like, hey, do you have a primary care? Are you enrolled at the VA? Is there, a provider that you could see? And we address other issues because we peel back that first layer of the trauma, and it opens up to other possibilities. So it's amazing to see, and it's something that I guess I just took for granted. I didn't realize that would happen, and I didn't realize how much that is holding the people that are affected the most, kind of like you mentioned before, who are suffering the most from dealing with what they have to deal with. So it's giving in so many other ways in terms of improving people's quality of life, not only emotionally, but actually even physically.
Yeah, you hit on a key point, and that is something I believe: trust is the basis for all relationships, and especially with individuals who have been damaged or hurt, the trust has got to go deeper. And if you can build that through sessions like you hold, or having meals together, or just calling somebody up and being a friend, that's what makes a difference in the world, right?
Absolutely, sir. You're so right, and I think as leadership, that's one of the key values. Is that, in the Army or in the armed forces, you'll follow a leader to hell and back. You just have to believe in them, not even necessarily the bigger mission, because we always say we're never really fighting for policy overseas. We're fighting really for the brothers and sisters to the left
Right.
and right of us, and that goes for leadership too. So,
Right.
well, let me give a quick call to action to our listeners. This book is entitled "If I Don't Return." It's a very well written book, also because it's not completely polished, right, sir? And you did that on purpose, correct?
Yep. Yep.
Right. So it's transcends military or civilian. It's about legacy. It's a really good book to read. Please look into it. Look into reaching the general if you'd like to have a further conversation. As you see, he's been incredibly generous with that, and I thank him for that. We can be a segue for that behind the scenes if anybody would like to reach out to us and see what we can do. Call to action to you, sir, is that if there's anything we can do in terms of journaling at a distance, remote, or anything, brothers and sisters, speaking, whatever it may be, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we appreciate what you're doing, and I hope and I can tell the value in what we're doing.
Yeah, I absolutely do, brother Ian. You are helping other people tell their stories, and that's one of the most important things we can do in life is understand what others go through. So thanks for doing what you're doing. Keep it up, and I hope you expand your outreach to a whole bunch of new people based on our conversation.
Will do, sir. So our time has come to an end, and as always, to our guest, sir, the last word.
No, I just appreciate what you're doing, brother. You are reaching people who need to be reached and giving them value. And that's what good people do. So thank you so much for, first of all, starting this organization and driving it along. But also thanks for having me on to talk a little bit about my experiences and my writing. And hopefully it inspires somebody else to take up that blank piece of paper and that pen and start on their own too.
Well said, sir. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and see you at the next one. Take care, everybody.